Elena's hands were shaking so badly that she had to press them against her stomach to keep anyone from noticing. The pack hall was packed with hundreds of wolves, all standing, all smiling, all watching Alpha Damon Voss slide a ring onto Sophie's finger. Elena's own sister, the woman who had shared a bedroom with her for 18 years, who had braided her hair before school, who had promised, only 2 years ago, that she would never do anything to hurt her. The priest's voice rolled through the hall like distant thunder, but Elena barely heard the words. She kept her eyes fixed on Damon's face, searching for some sign that this was a mistake, that he would look up and find her in the crowd and realize what he was about to do. He didn't look up. His eyes stayed on Sophie, soft and certain, the way they used to look at Elena during the quiet nights they had spent talking on the training grounds, back when Elena still believed their bond was building toward something real. She had told herself for 3 years that patience was a virtue. Damon was young for an alpha, only recently confirmed as leader after his father's passing, and pack elders had warned him more than once against choosing a mate too quickly. Elena had accepted the slow pace because she believed, foolishly, that slow meant certain. She had not expected slow to mean that he was quietly falling for her sister instead, in the same hallways, during the same family dinners, while Elena sat 2 feet away, unaware. Nobody had told her. Not her mother, who stood near the front row in a pale blue dress, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Not her father, who had walked Sophie down the aisle with pride written across every line of his face. Not even Sophie herself, until 3 days ago, when she had shown up at Elena's door with the ring already on her hand, and tears in her eyes, saying she was sorry, saying she never meant for it to happen, saying that love simply does not ask for permission. Elena had wanted to scream. Instead, she had nodded, hugged her sister stiffly, and promised to come to the wedding, because refusing would have confirmed to the entire pack that something had been stolen from her, and pride would not allow her to hand them that satisfaction. Now, standing in the 3rd row with her mother's cousins on either side, she understood that pride had a cost. Every second she remained in that hall was a second longer she had to watch the life she imagined slip fully and completely into her sister's hands. The priest pronounced them bonded. The hall erupted into applause, howls rising from the younger wolves near the back, someone's small child squealing with delight at the noise. Damon kissed Sophie, and Elena watched her sister's shoulders relax, watched the tension of the last 3 days finally drain out of her, replaced by relief. Sophie had been afraid Elena would make a scene. Elena would not give her that either. She clapped along with everyone else. She smiled when people turned to see her reaction. She accepted a glass of sparkling cider from a server weaving through the crowd and drank it slowly, letting the bubbles distract her throat from the tightness climbing up it. When the dancing began, she found her mother and complimented the flowers. When Sophie caught her eye across the room, hopeful and searching, Elena lifted her glass in a small toast and watched her sister's face brighten with gratitude. It took every ounce of control Elena possessed not to break down in front of 300 witnesses. The reception stretched into the evening. Elena danced once with her father, who held her a little too tightly, and murmured that he was proud of how gracefully she was handling things, not realizing that grace, in this case, was simply the last defense of someone with nothing left to lose. She spoke with pack members who asked polite, careful questions about her own future, about whether she had any prospects, about whether she planned to stay in Voss territory now that her sister was Luna. Each question landed like a small stone thrown at a wound that had not yet closed. By the time the band began playing the final set, Elena had run out of reasons to stay. She slipped out through a side door near the kitchen, away from the noise and the lantern light, and walked until the sound of celebration faded into the ordinary hum of crickets and wind through the trees. She stood at the edge of the training grounds where she and Damon used to talk, where he had once told her that she understood him better than anyone in the pack, where he had once taken her hand and said nothing needed to be said, because some things were simply known between 2 people. She realized now that everything he'd said to her could have been said to anyone. She had simply been the one standing close enough to hear it first. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere beyond the hills. Elena wrapped her arms around herself and made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like the only door left open to her. She would not stay in a territory ruled by the man who had chosen her sister over her, watching the 2 of them build a life together, attending family dinners where she would always be the aunt, never anything more. She would not spend years quietly performing contentment for an audience that had already decided her story was finished. She turned back toward the pack house, not to rejoin the celebration, but to pack. Her room felt smaller than she remembered as she pulled a canvas bag from beneath her bed and began filling it with the things that actually mattered. A few changes of clothes, a worn photograph of herself and Sophie as children, taken before either of them understood what an Alpha or a Luna even was. A small knife her grandmother had given her meant more as a keepsake than a weapon. She left behind the dress she had worn to the ceremony, folding it neatly on the bed as though someone might come looking for it, though she doubted anyone would notice her absence until well into the next day. She paused at her door and looked back at the room one last time. 10 years of her life had happened within these four walls. Late nights studying pack law with Sophie, whispered plans for a future that had once felt so certain. She let herself feel the loss for exactly one breath, and then she closed the door. The pack house was quiet by the time she made her way down the back stairwell, most of the staff still occupied with cleanup from the reception. She moved through the kitchen, grabbed a small bundle of bread and dried meat from the pantry, and slipped out into the cool night air through the servants' entrance. The border of Voss territory sat nearly 6 miles from the pack house, but Elena had walked those woods 100 times as a child, chasing Sophie through the trees during summers, when nothing in the world had felt broken yet. She knew the paths well enough to move quickly, even in the dark, even with her thoughts scattered, and her chest still tight with unshed tears. She did not run in her wolf form. She wanted the walk, wanted the time to feel her human feet on the earth, to let the distance build slowly instead of vanishing in a blur of speed. Each step away from the pack house felt like setting down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. By the time the moon rose fully over the tree line, Elena had crossed the first ridge separating the pack house from the outer farmlands. She stopped there and looked back at the distant glow of lantern light still visible through the trees, the faint sound of music carrying on the wind. Somewhere back there, her sister was dancing in her husband's arms, believing that everyone she loved was happy for her. Elena turned away and kept walking. She did not have a destination in mind, not really. She only knew 2 things with certainty. She could not stay in a place that would remind her every single day of what she had lost, and she was not willing to spend the rest of her life being pitied by people who had once respected her. Whatever came next, she would face it standing on her own feet, not as the sister left behind, not as the woman the Alpha had passed over, but as someone still capable of building something new. The night grew colder as she moved further from Voss lands, and Elena pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, grateful she had thought to grab it before leaving. She thought about her mother, who would worry when she noticed the empty room. She thought about her father, who would likely assume she had simply gone for an early morning run, as she often did after difficult evenings. She thought about Sophie, who would perhaps not notice at all until several days had passed, caught up in the golden haze of her new marriage. None of it stopped her feet from moving forward. By midnight, Elena had reached the old stone marker that separated Voss territory from the neutral lands beyond, a boundary she had never crossed in her life without an escort. Pack law discouraged unaccompanied travel through neutral zones, especially for women traveling alone, but Elena found she did not care about the risk as much as she probably should have. Whatever waited for her beyond that marker could not possibly hurt more than what she had just left behind. She placed her hand against the cool stone for a moment, feeling the rough texture beneath her palm, and then stepped past it, out of the only territory she had ever called home. The neutral lands were quieter than she expected, empty stretches of forest and open field that no pack claimed as their own, patrolled occasionally by wandering wolves who preferred no permanent allegiance. Elena walked until her legs ached and her eyes grew heavy, finally settling beneath the low branches of an old oak tree as the first hints of dawn began to color the sky. She did not sleep well. Every sound in the forest made her tense. Every rustle of leaves sent her hand toward the small knife tucked into her bag. But exhaustion eventually won out over fear, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, images of the wedding still flickering behind her closed eyes. When she woke, the sun had climbed well above the horizon, and her stomach ached with hunger. She ate what remained of the bread and dried meat, drank from a small stream she found nearby, and considered her options with a clearer head than she'd had the night before. She could not survive indefinitely in the wilderness. She needed shelter, food, some way to establish herself in a world that no longer included the comfort of her family pack. She thought briefly of returning, of swallowing her pride, and going back to face whatever waited for her. But the thought made her stomach twist with something close to nausea. Perhaps she would never be ready. Instead, she gathered her things and continued walking, following a worn path that seemed to lead deeper into the neutral lands, toward territory she had only ever heard about in warnings and rumors, the kind of place pack elders spoke of in low, cautious voices. She did not yet know that within a day, she would cross into land ruled by the one alpha her former pack considered its greatest enemy. She only knew that she could not go back, and that whatever lay ahead had to be better than watching her sister live the life that was supposed to have been hers. The forest thickened around her as the day wore on, tall pines replacing the familiar oaks of Voss territory, the air growing sharper and colder the further she traveled. She kept walking anyway, driven by a stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed until circumstance forced it out of her. By late afternoon, her legs trembled with exhaustion, and hunger gnawed steadily at her stomach again. She had eaten the last of her food that morning, and the small stream she'd found had long since disappeared behind her. She began to understand, with a growing sense of dread, that she had perhaps not thought this plan through as carefully as she should have. Still, she pressed on, telling herself that somewhere ahead there would be a town, a village, some sign of civilization where she could find work or shelter, even temporarily. She had a little money hidden in the lining of her bag, enough for a few nights somewhere warm if she found the right place. The sun began sinking toward the horizon again, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, when Elena heard something that made her stop cold in her tracks. A low growl, unmistakably wolf, carried through the trees ahead of her, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps moving through underbrush. She froze, her heart pounding, unsure whether to retreat or stand her ground. Before she could decide, 3 figures emerged from the tree line ahead, wolves in their human forms, watching her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Cautious, curious, perhaps a little suspicious. "You're on Ashford land," the tallest of the 3 said, his voice even but firm. "This territory doesn't welcome strangers without reason." Elena's mind raced. Ashford, she knew that name, had heard it spoken in her home pack with a mixture of respect and wariness her entire life. The Ashford pack was old, powerful, and had stood as Voss territory's fiercest rival for as long as anyone could remember. A rivalry rooted in decades of disputes over land and old grievances neither side had ever fully let go of. She had, without meaning to, walked directly into enemy territory. "I didn't mean to trespass," she said carefully, keeping her hands visible at her sides, the way she had been trained since childhood to do when facing an unfamiliar pack. "I'm not looking for trouble. I only need somewhere to rest, and then I'll be on my way." The 3 wolves exchanged a glance that Elena couldn't interpret. The tallest one studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving over her travel-worn clothes, the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "You're Voss," he said finally, not a question but a statement, and Elena felt her stomach drop. "I was," she said quietly, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Not anymore. Not by choice, exactly, but not anymore." Something in her tone must have carried weight, because the wolves' postures shifted slightly, the tension easing just enough that Elena allowed herself a small breath of relief. "Our alpha will want to hear about this," one of the others said, and before Elena could ask what that meant, the tallest wolf gestured for her to follow. She hesitated only a moment, before falling into step behind them, uncertain whether she had just found help or walked willingly into a new kind of danger. But exhaustion and hunger left her with little choice, and something in the back of her mind, quiet but insistent, told her that whatever waited ahead might be exactly what she needed, even if she couldn't yet understand why. The walk to the Ashford pack house took nearly an hour, winding through dense forest that eventually opened into cleared land, revealing a settlement far larger than Elena had expected. Stone buildings stood alongside wooden lodges, smoke curling from chimneys into the evening sky, the whole scene bathed in the warm glow of torchlight as darkness settled fully over the land. Elena's escorts led her toward the largest structure at the center of the settlement, a sprawling stone hall that radiated authority even from a distance. Her pulse quickened as they approached the entrance, uncertain what kind of reception awaited her inside, uncertain whether she had made the right choice in following these strangers, instead of running when she'd had the chance. The doors opened before they reached them, and a man stepped out into the torchlight, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to assess her in a single sweeping glance. Elena didn't need anyone to tell her who he was. Authority radiated from him in a way she recognized instantly, the same quiet, commanding presence she had once associated with Damon, though something about this man felt different, steadier somehow, less performative. "This is the woman we found at the eastern border," the tallest wolf explained. "Vosspack, traveling alone." The Alpha's eyes settled on Elena, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Elena forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, refusing to let exhaustion or fear show on her face, though both pressed heavily against her chest. "What's your name?" he asked finally, his voice low and even, carrying none of the hostility she had braced herself for. "Elena," she said. "Elena Marsh." Something flickered across his expression, too quick for Elena to fully interpret, gone before she could be certain she'd seen it at all. "I'm Kieran Ashford," he said. "You're a long way from home, Elena Marsh." "I don't have a home anymore," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them, raw and honest in a way she hadn't intended to be with a stranger, let alone the Alpha of her home pack's greatest enemy. Kieran studied her for another long moment, and Elena braced herself for questions, for suspicion, for the demand that she explain herself fully before being allowed even a moment's rest. Instead, he simply nodded, as though her answer, brief and incomplete as it was, told him everything he needed to know for now. "Get her food and a place to sleep," he said to the wolves who had brought her in. "We'll talk more in the morning." Elena blinked in surprise, unprepared for the simplicity of his response, the complete absence of interrogation or demand. She had expected suspicion, hostility, perhaps even outright rejection given the history between their two packs. Instead, she found herself being led toward a warm, well-lit lodge, a bowl of stew placed in front of her within minutes, exhaustion finally catching up with her all at once as the adrenaline of the day began to fade. She ate slowly, aware of the curious glances from the few pack members moving through the lodge, aware that her presence here was unusual, perhaps even unprecedented, but no one approached her with hostility. No one demanded she explain herself further, and by the time she finished eating, her body ached with a tiredness so complete that she could barely keep her eyes open. A young woman showed her to a small room near the back of the lodge, simple but clean, a narrow bed made up with fresh linens waiting for her. Elena sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment after the woman left, running her hands over the blanket, trying to process everything that had happened since she'd walked out of the wedding reception less than 24 hours ago. She had lost everything familiar in the span of a single day, her home, her family, the life she had imagined for herself. And yet here she was, unexpectedly safe, unexpectedly fed and sheltered, in the last place she ever could have imagined finding either. Elena lay back against the pillow, staring up at the wooden ceiling beams above her, and let herself finally cry, quietly, into the darkness of an unfamiliar room, grieving everything she had left behind, uncertain what tomorrow would bring, but grateful, in some small and confusing way, that tomorrow existed for her at all. Sleep took her slowly, pulling her under with a heaviness she hadn't felt in days, and for the first time since the wedding, Elena's mind finally went quiet. Morning came sooner than Elena expected, gray light filtering through a small window she hadn't noticed the night before. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for the familiar shape of her old bedroom, before memory returned in a rush and settled heavily over her chest. She rose slowly, aware of every ache in her body from the previous day's travel, and found a simple change of clothes folded neatly on a chair near the door, clearly left for her sometime during the night. She dressed quickly, grateful for the fresh clothing after a day spent in travel-worn fabric, and made her way out into the main lodge, uncertain what the day would bring. The lodge was quieter in the early morning, only a handful of pack members moving about, preparing meals, or heading out toward whatever work awaited them. Elena hovered near the entrance, unsure whether she should wait to be summoned or find her own way through the unfamiliar settlement. She didn't have to wonder long. A young man approached her within minutes, informing her that Alpha Ashford wished to speak with her, and led her back toward the stone hall she had seen the previous evening. Elena's stomach tightened with nerves as they walked, uncertain what this conversation would hold, uncertain whether the hospitality she'd received the night before would continue once questions began in earnest. Kieran Ashford was waiting for her in a smaller room off the main hall, seated behind a simple wooden desk covered in papers and maps. He looked up as she entered, gesturing for her to take the seat across from him, and Elena settled into it carefully, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "You slept well, I hope," he said, his tone carrying none of the coldness she had braced herself for. "Better than I expected," she admitted honestly. "Thank you for the hospitality. I know this isn't something you owed me." Kieran leaned back slightly, studying her with an expression Elena couldn't quite place, something between curiosity and careful consideration. "You said you don't have a home anymore. I'd like to understand what that means, if you're willing to explain." Elena hesitated, uncertain how much to share with a man whose pack had spent decades in rivalry with her own. But something about his manner, patient and unhurried, made her feel that honesty, at least in this moment, would serve her better than caution. So she told him, not everything, not yet, but enough. The wedding, her sister, the Alpha she had once believed shared a bond with her, only to watch him choose someone else in front of the entire pack. She kept her voice steady as she spoke, refusing to let old wounds show more than necessary, though she suspected Kieran could hear the pain beneath her carefully measured words regardless. When she finished, silence settled over the room for a long moment. Kieran's expression had shifted slightly, something harder and more guarded crossing his features, though Elena couldn't tell if the reaction was directed at her or at the situation she'd described. "Damon Voss," he said finally, and there was no mistaking the weight behind the name, the years of history compressed into two simple words. "You know him," Elena said, though it wasn't really a question. "I know of him," Kieran corrected. "Our packs haven't spoken directly in years, not since before I became Alpha. But the history between us runs deep, deeper than most territorial disputes usually go." Elena wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the roots of a rivalry that had shaped so much of her upbringing without ever being fully explained to her, but something in Kieran's expression told her this wasn't the moment for those questions. "You're welcome to stay here," he said instead, surprising her once again with the simplicity of the offer. "As long as you need. We're not in the habit of turning away someone in genuine need, regardless of which pack they came from." "Even Voss pack," Elena said carefully, testing the boundaries of his offer. "Even Voss pack," Kieran confirmed, something almost like amusement flickering across his face. "You're not responsible for the choices of your Alpha, Elena. I'd be a poor leader if I punished you for decisions that weren't yours to make." Relief washed through her, unexpected and overwhelming, and Elena had to blink back sudden tears, embarrassed by how quickly her composure threatened to crack in front of a man she had met only hours before. "Thank you," she managed finally, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't fully processed until this moment. "I don't know how to repay this kind of kindness." "You don't need to repay it," Kieran said simply. "Just rest, and figure out what you want your life to look like now. That's enough for the moment." Elena nodded, grateful beyond words for the space he was offering her, the absence of demands or expectations she had braced herself to face. She left his office feeling lighter than she had in days, though the ache of everything she'd lost remained tucked carefully beneath the surface, waiting for quieter moments to resurface. Over the following days, Elena settled slowly into the rhythm of Ashford pack life, finding small ways to make herself useful around the lodge, helping with meal preparation, assisting with the care of younger pack members whose parents were occupied with other duties. The work gave her something to focus on, besides the loss still fresh in her chest, and gradually, she found herself feeling less like an outsider and more like someone with a tentative place in this unfamiliar world. She crossed paths with Kieran more often than she expected, brief conversations in the lodge hallways, occasional meals shared when their paths happened to align. He never pushed her for more information than she offered, never made her feel like a burden or an obligation. And slowly, cautiously, Elena began to let her guard down around him, surprised by how easy his company had become. Word of her presence in Ashford territory spread slowly at first, then faster, carried by traders and wandering wolves who moved between packs. Elena knew it was only a matter of time before news reached Voss territory, before her family learned where she had gone and with whom she had found shelter. She wasn't sure how she felt about that inevitability, wasn't sure whether she hoped for her family's concern or dreaded their reaction to learning she had taken refuge with their oldest rival. She thought of Sophie often during those quiet early days, wondering if her sister had noticed her absence yet, wondering if guilt had begun to creep into the edges of her sister's happiness. She thought of her parents, imagining their worry, their confusion, their eventual anger when they learned exactly where their daughter had ended up. But mostly, she thought about the strange, unexpected comfort she had found in a place she never should have trusted, in the company of a man her entire life had taught her to fear. Elena didn't yet understand what that comfort meant, or where it might lead her, but for the first time since the wedding, she found herself looking forward to whatever came next, instead of dreading it. The forest surrounding Ashford territory seemed less foreboding with each passing day, the stone hall less intimidating, the pack members less like strangers, and more like people slowly becoming familiar. Elena still carried the weight of everything she had lost, still felt the occasional sharp pang of grief when memories of her old life surfaced unexpectedly. But beneath that grief, something new had begun to take root, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. She did not yet know what her life would become in this unfamiliar territory, surrounded by former enemies who had shown her nothing but unexpected kindness. But as she stood at the edge of the training grounds one evening, watching the sun set over land that did not belong to her yet somehow felt less foreign with each passing day, Elena allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that perhaps this unexpected detour might lead somewhere better than the life she had left behind. She had walked away from everything she once knew, expecting only uncertainty and hardship. Instead, she had found shelter in the last place she ever imagined, among people her old pack had taught her to distrust completely. Whatever came next, Elena understood that her old life was truly behind her now, and the woman who had once quietly accepted disappointment was slowly becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to choose her own path forward. Kieran found her there, as darkness settled fully over the training grounds, his footsteps quiet against the packed earth, as he came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the evening chill. "You've been quiet today," he observed, his eyes fixed on the same darkening horizon she'd been watching. "Just thinking," Elena admitted, "about everything that's happened, about what comes next." "And what does come next?" Kieran asked, turning to look at her directly, something careful and curious in his expression. Elena considered the question seriously, aware that her answer mattered more than she fully understood yet. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but for the first time in days, I'm not afraid to find out." Kieran's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them, comfortable rather than uncertain. Elena felt something shift quietly in her chest, small and unfamiliar, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but didn't want to dismiss either. Whatever waited ahead, she understood now that she would not face it alone, and for the first time since walking away from everything she once knew, that realization felt less like fear and more like the quiet, uncertain beginning of something worth discovering. The stars began appearing overhead as the last light faded completely, and Elena stood beside a man she had known for barely a week, in a territory she never should have trusted, feeling more at peace than she had in longer than she could remember. Whatever complications lay ahead, whatever her family's reaction would eventually be, whatever the deepening rivalry between their two packs might demand of her, Elena found herself unwilling to retreat from this unexpected path, unwilling to return to a life defined by someone else's choices. She had come to Ashford territory as a stranger fleeing heartbreak, uncertain and afraid. She was beginning, slowly and carefully, to imagine a different kind of future here, one she hadn't dared to hope for even a week earlier, and though the road ahead remained uncertain in every important way, Elena felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was finally walking towards something, rather than simply running away. 2 weeks passed before the first messenger arrived from Voss territory, and by then, Elena had begun to settle into a routine she hadn't expected to find so quickly. She woke early each morning to help with breakfast preparation, spent her afternoons assisting the pack's healer, an older woman named Margot who had taken a liking to Elena's steady hands and quiet patience. In the evenings, she often found herself walking the training grounds with Kieran, their conversations growing longer and easier with each passing day, though neither of them named what was slowly building between them. The messenger arrived on a gray afternoon, a young wolf Elena recognized from her old pack, someone who had trained alongside her years earlier. His name was Callum, and the surprise on his face when he saw her standing near the lodge entrance was almost comical, quickly replaced by a wary uncertainty that told her exactly how strange her presence here must have looked from the outside. "Elena," he said, his voice careful, as though unsure whether he was permitted to speak to her at all. "The whole pack thought something terrible had happened to you. Your mother has been out of her mind with worry." Elena felt a small pang of guilt at that, though it did nothing to shake her resolve. "I'm fine, Callum. Better than fine, actually. Tell her that, if you would." Callum glanced past her, toward the stone hall in the distance, his expression shifting into something more guarded. "You're staying here? With them?" "They took me in when I had nowhere else to go," Elena said simply. "That's more than I can say for anyone back home." Callum didn't respond to that directly, though something in his posture suggested he understood the weight behind her words better than he wanted to admit. "Alpha Voss sent me," he said instead. "He wants to know if the rumors are true, whether you're really here." "They're true," Elena confirmed. "You can tell him that as well." Callum hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the position he'd been placed in, caught between loyalty to his alpha and whatever remained of his old friendship with Elena. "He's not happy about it," he finally admitted. "Given the history between the packs, your being here could be seen as a problem." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach at that, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "A problem for who?" "I left the pack of my own free will, Callum. I didn't defect to enemy territory to cause trouble. I left because I had nothing left there worth staying for." Callum's expression softened slightly, something almost apologetic crossing his features. "I'm not judging you, Elena. I understand why you left, better than most people probably do. I just wanted you to know that this isn't going to go unnoticed. Alpha Voss doesn't take kindly to situations he can't control, and you being here, with Ashford, that's not something he can control." The warning in his words was clear, even if he hadn't stated it outright, and Elena felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her as Callum turned to leave, offering her one last searching look before disappearing back into the tree line. She found Kieran later that evening, sitting alone in his study, papers spread across his desk, in the familiar disorder she had come to associate with him. He looked up as she entered, something in her expression clearly telling him that whatever she'd come to discuss wasn't casual conversation. "Voss sent someone today," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Someone I used to know. He wanted confirmation that I was really here." Kieran's expression sharpened slightly, though his voice remained even when he spoke. "And what did you tell him?" "The truth. That I left on my own, and that this is where I chose to stay." Elena paused, choosing her next words carefully. "He said Damon isn't happy about it, that my being here could be seen as some kind of problem, given everything between your packs." Kieran leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment before responding. "Damon Voss has never needed much of an excuse to view Ashford territory as a problem," he said finally. "Our fathers spent decades in disputes over borders and resources that neither side has ever fully resolved. Your presence here gives him one more thing to be uneasy about, certainly, but it's not as though peace between our packs was ever close to guaranteed regardless." "I don't want to be the reason for more conflict between your packs," Elena said, guilt creeping into her voice despite her earlier resolve. "If my being here makes things worse, I could leave, find somewhere neutral to settle instead." "Elena," Kieran's voice carried a firmness that made her pause. "You are not responsible for decades of history that predates you entirely. If Damon Voss wants to manufacture conflict out of your choice to seek shelter where you were welcomed, that says everything about his character and nothing about yours." Something in his certainty settled the anxious churning in her stomach, though the underlying unease remained. She had known, on some level, that her presence here would not go unnoticed by her former pack, but hearing it, confirmed so directly, still left her rattled. "What happens if he decides to act on that unease?" she asked quietly. "What if he demands I return, or threatens some kind of retaliation for Ashford sheltering me?" Kieran's expression grew serious, though his voice remained steady. "Then we'll handle it as it comes. You're not a prisoner here, Elena, and you're not property to be returned on demand. If Damon Voss wants to test the boundaries of that, he'll find that Ashford territory doesn't respond well to threats." Elena appreciated the certainty in his words, though she couldn't fully shake the worry that her presence might be setting something dangerous into motion. A conflict between two powerful packs that had nothing to do with the original wound that had brought her here. Over the following days, that worry lingered in the back of her mind, coloring even the quieter moments of her new routine. She continued her work with Margot, continued her evening walks with Kieran, but found herself watching the tree line more carefully than before, half expecting another messenger, or worse, some more direct response from her former pack. The response, when it came, was neither a messenger nor an immediate threat, but something Elena hadn't anticipated at all. Nearly a week after Callum's visit, word reached the Ashford pack that Sophie herself had been asking questions, sending quiet inquiries through neutral traders, trying to determine whether the rumors about her sister were true. Elena felt a complicated tangle of emotions upon hearing this news, relief that her sister hadn't simply forgotten about her, mixed with lingering hurt that Sophie's concern had taken this long to surface at all. She wondered what her sister's marriage looked like now, whether the golden glow of the wedding had faded into something more complicated, whether Damon's unease about Elena's location had bled into his relationship with his new wife. She didn't have to wonder for long. Less than 2 weeks after Callum's visit, Elena was helping Margot sort dried herbs in the healer's workroom when a soft knock sounded at the door, and one of the younger pack members poked her head inside, informing Elena that someone was asking for her at the main gate. Elena's heart leaped into her throat as she made her way toward the settlement's entrance, uncertain what she would find there. The last person she expected to see standing nervously at the border, flanked by 2 Ashford guards who watched her with obvious suspicion, was her own sister. Sophie looked different than Elena remembered, thinner somehow, dark circles shadowing her eyes despite the careful makeup she'd applied to hide them. She wore a traveling cloak that couldn't fully disguise the slight curve beginning to show beneath it, and Elena felt her breath catch as understanding dawned. Sophie was pregnant. Elena. Sophie's voice broke slightly on her sister's name, relief and something more complicated flooding her expression as their eyes met across the distance separating them. "You're really here. You're really alive." "Of course I'm alive," Elena said, moving forward despite the guard's obvious hesitation, waving them back with a gesture she hoped conveyed enough authority to be respected. "Did you think something had happened to me?" "I didn't know what to think," Sophie admitted, tears welling in her eyes, as Elena stopped a few feet away, uncertain how close to get, how much of her sister's obvious distress to acknowledge. "You disappeared the night of the wedding without a word to anyone, and then, weeks passed with no sign of you, and then finally these rumors started that you were here, with Ashford of all places." "I needed to leave," Elena said simply, refusing to apologize for a decision she still believed had been necessary. "I couldn't stay and watch you and Damon build a life together, not after everything." Sophie flinched at that, guilt washing visibly across her features. "I know I hurt you, Elena. I've known it every single day since the wedding, and I'm sorrier than I know how to say. But I never imagined you'd end up here, in enemy territory, surrounded by people our whole family has spent our lives being taught to fear." "They're not what I expected," Elena said honestly. "They took me in when I had nowhere else to go, and nothing to offer in return. That's more than our own pack managed to do." The words landed harder than Elena intended, and she watched Sophie's face crumple slightly under the weight of them. "Please," Sophie said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please come home, Elena. Whatever's happened, whatever's changed, you're still my sister, and I miss you more than I know how to explain." Elena felt her resolve waver slightly at the raw pain in her sister's voice. Old habits of protectiveness and love resurfacing, despite everything that had happened between them. But beneath that instinct, something steadier held firm, a recognition that returning now would mean stepping back into a life defined by watching Sophie and Damon build the future that should have been hers. "I can't," Elena said gently, though the words still carried weight. "Not yet, and maybe not ever. I've found something here I didn't expect to find, Sophie. A place where I'm not defined by what I lost, or by comparison to what you've gained. I need time to understand what that means before I consider coming back to a place that will only remind me of everything I'm trying to move past." Sophie's tears fell freely now, and Elena felt her own eyes burning in response, the complicated tangle of love and hurt and loyalty threatening to overwhelm her composure. "Is it because of him?" Sophie asked quietly. "The Ashford Alpha? Are you staying because of what's happening between you two?" Elena startled at the question, uncertain how rumors of her growing closeness with Kieran had already reached her sister, though she supposed word traveled faster between packs than she'd fully appreciated. "It's complicated," she admitted, "but that's not the only reason I'm staying. I need this, Sophie. I need to be somewhere that isn't shaped entirely by what happened at your wedding." Sophie nodded slowly, though the hurt in her expression remained. "I understand," she said, though her voice suggested she was still working to convince herself of that understanding. "I don't like it, but I understand. Will you at least stay in touch? Let me know you're safe, even if you're not ready to come home?" "I can do that," Elena promised, and something in Sophie's shoulders eased slightly at the commitment, small as it was. They talked a while longer, careful and tentative, rebuilding a fragile connection that felt different from the easy closeness they'd once shared, but was not without its own value. Sophie mentioned, almost in passing, that things with Damon had grown strained since the wedding, that he seemed distracted and distant more often than not, though she offered no further explanation, and Elena didn't push for one. When Sophie finally turned to leave, promising to send word again soon, Elena watched her sister's retreating figure with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering sadness. Whatever remained between them was fragile and uncertain, but it was something, and Elena found herself grateful for even that small thread of connection remaining intact. She found Kieran waiting near the main hall when she returned, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena could tell he'd been informed of her sister's visit almost immediately. "How are you?" he asked simply, and something in the directness of the question, free of judgment or demand, eased the tension still coiled tight in her chest. "Complicated," Elena admitted, sinking onto a nearby bench, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the encounter. "She's pregnant. Damon's child, and she seems unhappy, though she didn't say so directly." Kieran settled beside her, close enough that his presence felt steadying rather than intrusive. That must be difficult to witness, even from a distance. "It is," Elena agreed. "But I don't regret staying here. I don't regret choosing this, even knowing how complicated it makes everything with my family." "Good," Kieran said simply, and something in the quiet certainty of his response settled the last of the unease still lingering in Elena's chest. They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon light began to fade, and Elena found herself, not for the first time, grateful for the unexpected path that had led her here, to this territory, to this man, to a version of her life she never could have imagined the night she'd walked away from her sister's wedding. Whatever complications lay ahead, whatever her family's continued reactions might bring, Elena felt increasingly certain that she had made the right choice in refusing to let her old life define the rest of her story. The weeks that followed Sophie's visit brought a strange kind of steadiness to Elena's days, a rhythm she hadn't expected to find so completely in a place that had once represented everything her old pack taught her to fear. She continued her work with Margot, growing more skilled with each passing week at identifying herbs and preparing remedies, finding a quiet satisfaction in work that asked nothing of her except attention and care. In the evenings, her walks with Kieran had become an unspoken tradition, neither of them naming it directly, both of them arranging their days around the certainty that they would find each other as the sun began to set. It was during one of these evening walks, nearly a month after her arrival, that Kieran finally spoke about something Elena had wondered about since her first days in Ashford territory: the deeper roots of the rivalry between their two packs, the history that ran beneath the surface tension she had witnessed in Callum's visit, and in the careful watchfulness of the guards who had first found her at the border. They had settled onto a low stone wall, overlooking a small creek that ran through the eastern edge of the training grounds, the evening air carrying the scent of approaching autumn, cool and sharp against Elena's skin. Kieran had been unusually quiet during their walk, something clearly weighing on his mind, and Elena had learned enough about him by now to recognize when patience served better than questions. "You've never asked why I took you in so easily," he said finally, his eyes fixed on the water moving steadily past them. "Most alphas would have been far more cautious about sheltering someone from a rival pack, especially given everything my family has endured because of Voss territory." Elena turned to look at him more fully, sensing that whatever he was about to share mattered deeply to him. "I assumed you were simply kinder than most alphas," she said honestly, "but I'd like to understand the real reason, if you're willing to share it." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly, as though the memory he was about to share still carried weight, even after however many years had passed. "I had a sister," he said finally. "Older than me, though not by much. Her name was Marisol." Elena noticed immediately the way he spoke of her in the past tense, and something cold settled in her stomach in anticipation of whatever painful history was about to unfold. "She fell in love with someone from Voss territory," Kieran continued, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the memory. "This was years ago, before either Damon or I became alpha, back when our fathers led our respective packs. Marisol believed, foolishly perhaps, that love could overcome decades of rivalry between our territories. She trusted the man completely, believed he intended to bond with her properly, believed their relationship would eventually bridge the gap between our two packs." Elena felt a growing sense of dread as she listened, sensing where this story was likely heading long before Kieran finished telling it. "She was wrong," Kieran said simply, though the weight behind those two words suggested far more pain than the brevity implied. "He used her feelings against her, extracted information about our pack's territory and resources under the guise of romantic confidence, and when he had what he needed, he abandoned her entirely, humiliated her in front of both packs by revealing the affair publicly, and framing her as the pursuer, someone who had tried to seduce him for the sake of political advantage." "That's horrible," Elena said quietly, genuine anger rising in her chest on behalf of a woman she had never met, but whose pain she suddenly understood far too intimately. "It destroyed her," Kieran continued. "Not just her reputation, though that suffered greatly, but something deeper. She never fully recovered from the humiliation, from the realization that someone she had trusted completely had used her so callously. She left Ashford territory a few years later, unable to bear staying in a place that constantly reminded her of what had happened, and I haven't seen her in nearly a decade." Elena reached out instinctively, resting her hand over his where it gripped the edge of the stone wall, offering what comfort she could without words. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "That kind of betrayal, and then losing her on top of it, that's an enormous amount of pain to carry." Kieran turned his hand slightly beneath hers, not quite holding it, but not pulling away either, and Elena felt something shift quietly between them in that small gesture. "When my scouts brought word that they'd found a woman from Voss territory at our border, fleeing something related to her own alpha's choices, I understood immediately that I couldn't turn you away," Kieran said, his voice steadier now, though still carrying the weight of the story he'd just shared. "Not because I saw Marisol in you exactly, but because I understood, more than most people could, what it means to be discarded by someone you trusted, to have your pain treated as inconvenient rather than legitimate. So you took me in because of her," Elena said, understanding settling over her slowly. "Because you couldn't offer her the protection she needed, so you offered it to me instead." "Partly," Kieran admitted, though it became something more than that fairly quickly, if I'm honest. Elena's heart quickened slightly at the implication in his words, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, uncertain whether she was ready to name what had been slowly building between them over the past month. "I'm not her," Elena said carefully. "I don't want you to see me as some chance to correct what happened to your sister, Kieran. I need you to see me, not a substitute for someone else's pain." "I do see you," Kieran said, turning to face her more fully now, something earnest and unguarded in his expression that Elena hadn't seen from him before. I saw you from the first conversation we had, Elena. Someone who chose to walk away from a life that would have kept her small and diminished. Someone who found the strength to build something new, rather than simply accepting the role others tried to assign her. That has nothing to do with Marisol. That's entirely about who you are. Something warm bloomed in Elena's chest at his words, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge until this moment, though it had been building steadily beneath the surface of their growing friendship for weeks now. She studied his face in the fading evening light, taking in the sincerity there, the careful vulnerability he'd shown by sharing his sister's story with her at all. "Thank you for telling me about her," Elena said softly. "I know that couldn't have been easy to share." "I wanted you to understand," Kieran said, "not just why I took you in, but why the rivalry between our packs runs deeper than simple territorial disputes. There's real pain on both sides, old wounds that never properly healed. I don't want history to repeat itself. Not with you, not with anyone." Elena nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was telling her, the careful boundary he seemed to be drawing around whatever was building between them, a boundary meant to protect rather than distance. "I don't intend to let it," she said firmly. "Whatever happens between us, Kieran, I won't let it become another chapter in a story about betrayal and pain. I've had enough of that already." Something eased in Kieran's expression at her words, and for a long moment, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, the creek continuing its steady path beside them, the last light of evening slowly giving way to the soft glow of stars overhead. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said eventually, breaking the silence carefully. "Of course. Do you think Marisol would ever consider coming back, now that you're Alpha, now that things have changed?" Kieran was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've sent word to her occasionally over the years, through channels that don't require direct contact, letting her know she'd always be welcome to return if she wanted to. She's never responded, though I don't know if that means she never received the messages, or simply isn't ready to face this place again. I hope she finds peace, wherever she is," Elena said sincerely, and Kieran offered her a small, grateful smile in response. They remained at the creek's edge until full darkness settled over the training grounds, their conversation drifting into easier topics, though the weight of what had been shared lingered comfortably between them, a new layer of understanding added to the foundation they had been building since Elena's arrival. As they finally rose to walk back toward the lodge, Kieran's hand found hers naturally, without hesitation or question, and Elena let him hold it, appreciating the simple warmth of the gesture, the quiet certainty it seemed to carry. Whatever was building between them, she understood now that it was rooted in something real, something neither of them intended to treat carelessly, regardless of the complicated history between their two packs. The following days brought a subtle shift in their dynamic, small moments of closeness that neither of them commented on directly, but that both seemed to welcome. Kieran began seeking her out more deliberately throughout the day, not just during their evening walks, finding excuses to include her in pack decisions, asking her opinion on matters that extended beyond simple hospitality toward something that felt increasingly like genuine partnership. Elena found herself looking forward to these moments more than she was willing to fully admit, even to herself, the careful walls she had built around her heart since the wedding slowly beginning to soften in ways that both excited and unsettled her. She had trusted completely once before, had believed in a connection that turned out to be one-sided, and the fear of repeating that mistake lingered, even as her feelings for Kieran continued to deepen. One afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after her arrival, Margot pulled her aside during their work in the healer's cottage, studying Elena with the kind of knowing look that suggested the older woman had noticed far more than Elena had realized. "You're happier than when you first arrived," Margot observed, sorting dried lavender into careful bundles as she spoke. "It shows in how you carry yourself, in how you speak of things now, compared to those first difficult weeks." Elena felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, uncertain how to respond to the older woman's directness. "Ashford has been good to me," she said carefully. "More than I expected, honestly. And our Alpha has been good to you as well, I think," Margot added, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I've served this pack for nearly 30 years, child. I know the look of a man who's found something he wasn't expecting to find, And Kieran Ashford has worn that look since the day you arrived at our border. Elena's heart quickened at Margot's words, the confirmation of feelings she had been carefully avoiding naming, even in her own thoughts. I don't know what's happening between us, she admitted honestly. I trusted someone completely before, and it cost me everything I thought I understood about my own life. I don't know if I'm ready to trust that fully again. Margot set down her work, turning to face Elena directly, her expression softening with genuine understanding. Trust isn't something you decide all at once, child. It builds slowly, through actions rather than words, through consistency rather than promises. From what I've observed, Kieran has given you nothing but that kind of steady consistency since the day you arrived. That's not nothing, especially compared to whatever brought you here in the first place. Elena considered the older woman's words carefully, recognizing the truth in them, even as old fears continued to whisper caution in the back of her mind. She thought of Damon, of the years she had spent believing their connection meant something, only to discover it had all been built on assumptions she'd never fully confirmed. Kieran was different. She understood that intellectually, had witnessed it in every interaction they'd shared over the past 6 weeks. But understanding something intellectually and trusting it fully with her heart remained two very different things. I want to trust it, Elena admitted quietly. I'm just afraid of what happens if I'm wrong again. Then don't rush it, Margot said gently. Let it build at its own pace. Real connection doesn't need to be forced, child. If what's growing between you and our alpha is genuine, it will withstand the time you need to feel certain about it. Elena appreciated the wisdom in Margot's words, and though the fear didn't disappear entirely, something in her chest loosened slightly, permission granted to move at whatever pace felt right, rather than forcing certainty before she was ready to feel it fully. That evening, as she walked with Kieran along their now familiar path toward the creek, Elena found herself studying him more openly than she had allowed herself to before, taking in the steady patience he'd shown her since her arrival, the careful respect for her boundaries, even as his own feelings had clearly deepened alongside hers. Margot thinks you've fallen for me, she said, testing the words aloud, curious how he would respond to such directness. Kieran's steps faltered slightly, though his expression remained composed as he glanced over at her. Margot has always been perceptive, he said carefully. Does that trouble you? No, Elena said, surprising herself with how easily the honesty came. I think I've fallen for you too, if I'm being truthful. I'm just afraid of what that means, given everything I've already survived. Kieran stopped walking entirely, turning to face her fully, something earnest and vulnerable in his expression that Elena hadn't seen from him since he'd shared Marisol's story weeks earlier. I would never do to you what Damon did, he said firmly. I understand you have every reason to be cautious, Elena, and I won't rush you toward certainty you're not ready to feel. But I need you to know that whatever this is between us, I don't take it lightly. I haven't felt anything like this in longer than I can remember, and I don't intend to treat it carelessly. Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, moved by the sincerity in his words, by the careful respect he continued to show her, even as he admitted the depth of his own feelings. I believe you, she said softly, and meant it fully for the first time since arriving in Ashford territory. They stood together at the edge of the training grounds, as darkness settled fully around them, the weight of everything unspoken between them finally beginning to find words. And Elena understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever fear still lingered from her past, she was ready to let this new connection grow into whatever it was meant to become. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of moment Elena would later realize she should have expected sooner, given everything that had been building steadily between herself and Kieran over the previous weeks. She had been helping carry supplies from the storage cellar to the main lodge, her arms full of preserved vegetables for the evening meal, when Kieran rounded the corner unexpectedly and nearly collided with her, both of them stumbling to avoid dropping everything she carried. His hands caught her shoulders to steady her, and the moment his skin met hers, something shifted violently in Elena's chest, a warmth spreading through her entire body that had nothing to do with simple physical contact. She looked up at him, startled, and found the same shock reflected in his own expression, his eyes wide with sudden recognition. You felt that, Elena said, though it wasn't really a question. She knew what this was, had heard about it described countless times growing up, though she had never experienced it herself until this exact moment. The mate bond, unmistakable once it revealed itself, an undeniable pull that connected two people on a level deeper than simple attraction or affection. Kieran's hands remained on her shoulders, neither of them moving to break the contact, both too stunned by the sudden clarity of what had just been confirmed between them. "I felt it," he confirmed, his voice rougher than usual, carrying an intensity Elena hadn't heard from him before. "I suspected, honestly, weeks ago, but I didn't want to say anything until I was certain, until you had time to decide what you wanted, without feeling pressured by something neither of us could fully control." Elena understood immediately what he meant. The mate bond, once acknowledged, carried weight that could feel overwhelming. A connection so fundamental that some wolves found themselves swept into commitments before they'd had proper time to consider what they actually wanted. Kieran had waited, had given her space to build genuine feelings for him separate from whatever biological pull existed beneath the surface, and something in that careful restraint moved her more deeply than she could easily express. "I need time," Elena admitted honestly, though she made no move to step away from him, the pull between them too strong and too welcome to resist entirely. "This is a lot to process, given everything that happened with Damon. I believed I understood what connection meant with him too, and I was wrong." "This isn't the same," Kieran said gently, though he didn't argue against her need for space, didn't pressure her toward immediate acceptance of what had just been confirmed between them. "A mate bond isn't something either of us chooses consciously, Elena. It's not built on assumptions or unspoken hopes. It's real, in a way that whatever you believed you shared with Damon never was." Elena knew he was right, understood the fundamental difference between the uncertain connection she had spent years hoping meant something with Damon, and the undeniable pull now confirmed between herself and Kieran. But knowledge and readiness remained separate things, and she needed time to reconcile what her body and instincts recognized as true with the careful walls she had built around her heart since the wedding. "Take whatever time you need," Kieran said, finally releasing her shoulders, though his eyes remained fixed on hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "I'm not going anywhere, Elena. Whatever pace you need to move at, I'll match it." Elena nodded, grateful once again for his patience, though the confirmed bond between them made maintaining any kind of measured distance considerably more difficult than it had been before. She could feel the pull of it now, even as they stood several feet apart in the following days, an awareness of him that seemed to hum constantly beneath the surface of her thoughts, impossible to fully ignore regardless of how much space they maintained physically. Days passed, and Elena found herself wrestling with the reality of what had been confirmed between them, turning the question over repeatedly in her mind during quiet moments alone. She thought of her parents, who had shared a mate bond her entire life, watching them communicate wordlessly, understanding each other in ways that seemed almost supernatural to Elena as a child. She thought of the stories she'd heard about bonded pairs who had ignored their connection, who had suffered for years afterward, a persistent ache that never fully faded, regardless of how hard they tried to move past it. She thought too of Damon, of the years she had spent convincing herself their connection meant something significant, only to watch him choose Sophie without hesitation or apparent difficulty. If what she'd felt for Damon had been real, in even a fraction of the way this bond with Kieran felt real, she doubted he could have walked away from it so easily. The realization settled something in her chest, a clarity she hadn't expected to find so definitively. Whatever she had shared with Damon had never carried this weight, this undeniable certainty that now colored every interaction with Kieran. She had spent years chasing something that had never truly existed, while this, standing directly in front of her, offered a foundation she hadn't dared to hope for after everything she'd survived. She found Kieran nearly a week after the bond had first revealed itself, standing alone near the training grounds as the evening light began to soften around them, the same spot where they had first shared Marisol's story weeks earlier. He turned as she approached, something hopeful and careful in his expression, clearly reading the resolve in her posture before she'd spoken a single word. "I'm ready," Elena said simply, closing the distance between them, until she stood close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "I've spent the last week trying to understand the difference between what I felt for Damon and what I feel for you, and there is no comparison, Kieran. What we have is real, in a way I never experienced with him, not once, not even during the years I believed we shared something meaningful. Kieran's expression softened with visible relief, though he remained still, waiting for her to finish, giving her the space to say everything she needed to say before responding. I'm still afraid, Elena continued honestly. Trusting completely again, after everything that happened, that's not something I can promise will come easily, but I want to try. I want to see where this goes, without holding back out of fear that history will repeat itself. Thank you, Kieran said softly, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands, the gesture careful and reverent, despite the intensity clearly building beneath his composed exterior. I promise you, Elena, I will spend every day proving that this connection deserves your trust. You don't have to give it all at once. Just give me the chance to earn it, piece by piece, for as long as it takes. Elena felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, moved by the sincerity of his promise, by the careful patience he continued to offer, even now that the bond between them had been fully acknowledged. She leaned into his touch, allowing herself, for the first time since the wedding, to fully trust the warmth building in her chest, to believe that this connection might actually be as steady and genuine as it felt. Their first kiss, when it finally came, carried none of the uncertainty that had colored her memories of moments with Damon. It felt inevitable, natural, a confirmation of something that had been building steadily since the night she'd first arrived at Ashford's border, exhausted and afraid, never expecting to find anything like this waiting for her among people she'd been taught her entire life to distrust. Word of the confirmed bond spread quickly through the Ashford pack, met with widespread approval and genuine warmth from pack members who had watched their alpha's growing attachment to Elena over the previous weeks. Margot found her the following morning, pulling her into a warm embrace before Elena had even fully processed the older woman's approach. I knew it, Margot said, pride evident in her voice. I told you, child, real connection builds at its own pace. I'm so happy for you both. Elena laughed, genuine and unguarded, a sound that felt increasingly natural the longer she remained in Ashford territory. Thank you for your patience with me, Margot. I don't think I would have found the courage to accept this without your wisdom pushing me gently in the right direction. You would have found your way regardless, Margot said, waving off the credit with characteristic modesty. Some connections are simply too strong to deny forever, no matter how cautious the heart wants to be. The following weeks brought a deepening ease to Elena's life within Ashford territory, the careful boundaries she had maintained during her first months, slowly dissolving into something more natural and complete. She spent more time in Kieran's company, not just during their evening walks but throughout the day, finding herself increasingly involved in the daily workings of pack leadership, her opinions sought and valued in ways that surprised her, given how briefly she had been part of this community. She still thought of Sophie often, still worried about the strain evident in her sister's brief visit weeks earlier, though the growing happiness she'd found with Kieran made those worries feel more distant, less consuming than they had been during her first difficult weeks in Ashford territory. She sent word occasionally through neutral traders, brief messages confirming her continued safety and well-being, careful not to reveal too much detail about the depth of her growing relationship with Kieran, uncertain how that information might complicate an already fragile situation with her family. But word, as it inevitably does, found its way back to Voss territory regardless of her caution, carried by the same network of traders and wandering wolves who had first brought news of her presence in Ashford lands. Elena didn't learn of this until nearly 2 months after the mate bond had first been confirmed, when Callum returned to the Ashford border, his expression grave and uncertain as he requested another audience with her. You've heard then, Elena said, meeting him at the same spot where their first conversation had taken place months earlier, though the woman standing before him now carried herself with considerably more confidence and certainty than the frightened stranger who had first sought shelter in Ashford territory. The whole pack has heard, Callum confirmed, his voice careful. A mate bond with the Ashford Alpha himself. Elena, do you understand what this means? What kind of position this places you in, given everything between our two territories? I understand exactly what it means, Elena said firmly. It means I've found something real, something I never experienced during my years believing I shared a connection with Damon. I won't apologize for that, Callum, regardless of how complicated it makes things for everyone else. Callum studied her for a long moment, something like grudging respect crossing his features, despite the obvious concern still evident in his posture. Alpha Voss isn't taking the news well, he admitted finally. He's called an emergency council meeting, gathering the pack elders to discuss what this means for Voss territory, whether the bond represents some kind of threat, given Ashford's history with us. Elena felt a familiar coldness settle in her stomach at this news, though she refused to let it show in her expression. It's not a threat, she said firmly. It's a personal choice, Callum, made by two consenting adults who found something real between them. If Damon wants to interpret it as political maneuvering, that says far more about his own paranoia than about anything Kieran or I have actually done. I hope you're right, Callum said, though his tone suggested lingering doubt. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried about what comes next, Elena. Tensions between our territories haven't been this high in years, and now, with this news added to everything else. He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging heavily between them, and Elena felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders as Callum finally turned to make his way back toward Voss territory. Whatever peace she had found in Ashford lands, whatever certainty she had discovered in her bond with Kieran, the shadow of her old pack's disapproval remained, a complication she had known would eventually surface, but had allowed herself to temporarily forget during the quiet happiness of the previous months. She found Kieran later that evening, sharing Callum's warning with careful honesty, watching his expression grow serious as he absorbed the implications of what she'd told him. We knew this moment would come eventually, Kieran said finally, reaching for her hand with the same steady reassurance he'd offered since the day they'd first met. Whatever Damon decides to do with this news, we'll face it together, Elena. I'm not going to let old rivalries dictate what we've built here. Elena nodded, drawing strength from his certainty, though the anxious knot in her stomach remained as she considered what lay ahead. Whatever peace they had found together in the quiet months since her arrival, she understood now that it would soon be tested by forces far larger than either of them alone could fully control. Sophie arrived at the Ashford border on a cold morning nearly 3 weeks after Callum's warning, unannounced and visibly distressed, her traveling cloak wrapped tightly around a belly now rounded enough that walking any real distance must have exhausted her considerably. Elena rushed to meet her the moment word reached the lodge, alarm spiking through her chest at the sight of her sister standing alone at the border. No guards or escorts accompanying her, despite how far advanced her pregnancy had become. Sophie, what happened? Elena asked, reaching her sister's side and taking in the exhaustion etched across her features, the redness around her eyes that suggested days of crying, rather than a single difficult morning. You shouldn't be traveling in your condition, not without an escort. I couldn't stay there anymore, Sophie said, her voice cracking with an emotion that sounded like a mixture of exhaustion and desperation. I needed to see you, Elena. I needed to talk to someone who might actually understand what's happening. Elena guided her sister toward the lodge immediately, calling for Margot's assistance as they walked, settling Sophie into a warm chair near the fire, while the healer checked her over carefully to ensure the pregnancy hadn't been endangered by the difficult journey. Once Margot confirmed that both Sophie and the baby remained healthy despite the strain of travel, Elena finally allowed herself to focus fully on her sister, taking the seat across from her and waiting patiently for whatever had driven Sophie to make such a dangerous journey alone. Tell me what's going on, Elena said gently, once Sophie had been given a warm drink and a few moments to collect herself. Something's clearly wrong, Sophie. You wouldn't have traveled this far in your condition otherwise. Sophie's hands trembled slightly around her cup as she began to speak, her words coming slowly at first, then faster as the dam of everything she'd been holding back finally broke. Things haven't been right between Damon and me since shortly after the wedding, she admitted. I told myself it was normal, that every new marriage has an adjustment period, but it's gotten worse rather than better, especially since word reached him about your bond with the Ashford Alpha. Elena felt a fresh wave of guilt at this news, though she pushed it down carefully, reminding herself that she wasn't responsible for the choices her former Alpha had made regarding their marriage, or his reaction to her own happiness elsewhere. He's become distant, Sophie continued, her voice thick with unshed tears, distracted, irritable, spending long hours alone in his study without explanation. At first I thought it was simply the pressure of pack leadership, but lately, Elena, I've begun to wonder if he regrets choosing me at all. The words hung heavily in the air between them, and Elena felt a complicated tangle of emotions rise in response. Old hurt mixing uncomfortably with genuine sympathy for her sister's obvious pain. "What makes you think that?" she asked carefully. Sophie hesitated, clearly struggling to put words to something she'd perhaps not fully allowed herself to acknowledge until this moment. "Small things, mostly. The way he sometimes looks at me like he's searching for something that isn't there. Comments he's made, careless things that slipped out during arguments, suggesting that he sometimes wonders if he made the right choice." Elena's stomach twisted at this revelation, uncertain how to respond to the implication clearly buried within her sister's words. "Sophie, are you saying he regrets marrying you? Because of me?" "I don't know," Sophie admitted, tears finally spilling over as her composure crumbled entirely. "I've wondered, more times than I want to admit, whether he actually loved me at all, or whether choosing me was simply easier than confronting whatever he actually felt for you. I know how terrible that sounds, especially given everything I did to you. But I need to understand the truth, Elena, even if it destroys what little peace I've managed to find in this marriage." Elena reached across the small distance between them, taking her sister's trembling hands in her own, old resentment softening in the face of Sophie's obvious distress. "I don't know what's in Damon's heart," she said honestly. "I spent years believing I understood our connection, and I was completely wrong. I can't tell you what he actually feels for you, Sophie, only that whatever complicated feelings he may or may not have about me shouldn't diminish what you deserve from your own marriage." Sophie nodded slowly, though the tears continued falling, exhaustion and hormonal upheaval clearly compounding the emotional weight of everything she was trying to process. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Scared of raising a child in a marriage that might already be broken. Scared of what happens if Damon's feelings for you never actually faded. Scared that I've trapped myself in a life built on someone else's unresolved heart." Elena felt her own eyes burning with unshed tears, moved by the raw vulnerability her sister was finally allowing herself to show, a vulnerability Sophie had carefully hidden during her previous visit months earlier. "You're not trapped," Elena said firmly. "Whatever happens with Damon, Sophie, you have options. You don't have to stay in a marriage that leaves you feeling this uncertain and unhappy, regardless of the child you're carrying." "It's not that simple," Sophie said, though something in her expression suggested she was considering Elena's words more seriously than her immediate protest indicated. "I'm Luna now, Elena. Leaving would mean upending the entire pack's stability, would mean facing judgment from everyone who witnessed our wedding, who believed in the future Damon and I were supposed to build together." "Your happiness matters more than other people's expectations," Elena said, drawing on hard-won wisdom from her own difficult months of learning, to prioritize her own well-being over the comfort of others' assumptions about her life. "I understand that better than almost anyone, Sophie. I spent years accepting less than I deserved, because leaving felt too complicated, too disruptive to everyone else's expectations. Don't make that same mistake if you can help it." Sophie considered her sister's words carefully, something shifting in her expression as the weight of months of quiet unhappiness finally found space to be acknowledged directly. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. "I love this baby already, more than I know how to fully express. But I'm not certain anymore that staying with Damon is what's best for either of us." They talked for hours that afternoon, longer and more honestly than they had managed during Sophie's earlier visit. Old resentments, slowly giving way to a rebuilding of the closeness they had shared before everything fell apart at the wedding. Elena found herself grateful for the honesty finally passing between them, even as the details Sophie shared about Damon's behavior left her troubled and uncertain about what complications might still lie ahead. Kieran joined them briefly as evening approached, offering Sophie genuine warmth and hospitality, despite the obvious tension inherent in hosting the wife of his pack's greatest rival within Ashford territory. Sophie watched the easy affection between Elena and Kieran with an expression that mixed genuine happiness for her sister with something more complicated, perhaps a quiet grief for the uncertain state of her own marriage, compared to the clear devotion evident between Elena and her new mate. "You seem happy here," Sophie observed, once Kieran had excused himself to attend to other pack matters, leaving the sisters alone once more. "Genuinely happy, in a way I'm not sure I ever saw from you before. Not even during those years you believed Damon might choose you. I am happy, Elena confirmed. Happier than I ever expected to be again, especially after everything that happened. Kieran sees me clearly, Sophie. In a way Damon never did, not really. I understand that now. Looking back on those years I spent hoping for something that was never actually there. Sophie nodded slowly, absorbing this with visible difficulty. Old guilt clearly resurfacing, despite the progress they'd made toward rebuilding their relationship over the course of the afternoon. I'm glad you found this, she said finally, her voice carrying genuine sincerity, despite the complicated emotions clearly still churning beneath the surface. Even if it complicates things between our packs, even if Damon's reaction to your bond has made everything harder, I'm glad you found real happiness, Elena. You deserve that, more than anyone I know. Elena squeezed her sister's hand gratefully, moved by the genuine warmth in Sophie's words despite everything complicated still standing between them. Thank you for saying that, she said softly. It means more than you probably realize. As evening deepened into full darkness, Elena insisted Sophie remain in Ashford territory overnight, rather than risk the dangerous journey back to Voss lands in her condition, arranging for her sister to stay in the same small room Elena herself had occupied during her first uncertain nights in this unfamiliar territory. Sophie accepted gratefully, clearly exhausted by both the physical strain of travel and the emotional weight of everything they'd discussed throughout the afternoon. Before retiring for the night, Sophie paused at the doorway of her temporary room, turning back to look at Elena with an expression that carried both gratitude and lingering uncertainty. What should I do, Elena? About Damon? About everything? Elena considered the question carefully, understanding the weight of what her sister was truly asking, recognizing that whatever advice she offered now would carry significant influence over decisions that would shape Sophie's future considerably. I can't tell you what to do, she said honestly. But I can tell you that you deserve a partner who chooses you fully, without reservation or lingering uncertainty about other choices they might have made instead. If Damon can't offer you that, Sophie, then perhaps it's worth asking yourself whether staying serves either of you well, regardless of how complicated leaving might initially seem. Sophie nodded slowly, absorbing her sister's words with visible consideration, though she offered no immediate response beyond a quiet expression of gratitude, before finally retreating into her room for the night. Elena remained standing in the hallway for several long minutes after her sister's door closed, worry and cautious hope tangling together in her chest as she considered what complications might still lie ahead, both for her sister's uncertain marriage and for the growing tension between their two territories that seemed increasingly likely to reach some kind of breaking point in the near future. She found Kieran waiting for her near the main hall, concern evident in his expression as she recounted the details of her conversation with Sophie, watching his jaw tighten slightly as she described Damon's apparent regret and distraction since news of her bond with Kieran had reached Voss territory. This complicates things considerably, Kieran said finally, once Elena had finished sharing everything Sophie had told her. If Damon's marriage is genuinely struggling because of unresolved feelings toward you, that gives him considerably more motivation to view our bond as a personal affront, rather than simply a political inconvenience. I know, Elena said quietly, worry evident in her voice. I don't know what he might do with that kind of motivation, Kieran. Sophie seemed genuinely afraid of how unstable things have become within their marriage, and if that instability translates into some kind of action against Ashford territory. She trailed off, unable to fully articulate the fear building steadily in her chest as she considered the possibilities. Kieran reached for her hand, offering the same steady reassurance he'd provided since the earliest days of her arrival in Ashford territory. Whatever comes, we'll face it together, he said firmly. I won't let old grievances or Damon's personal regrets destroy what we've built here, Elena. I promise you that. Elena nodded, drawing strength from his certainty, even as the shadow of what might still lie ahead continued to weigh heavily on her thoughts throughout the remainder of that difficult, revealing evening. Sophie left the following morning, rested, but still visibly burdened by everything unresolved in her own life, promising to write again soon and to think carefully about the choices Elena had encouraged her to consider. Elena watched her sister's careful, slow progress back toward the tree line with a heavy heart, uncertain what future awaited Sophie within a marriage that seemed to be crumbling under the weight of unspoken regret and misplaced comparison. For nearly 2 weeks afterward, an uneasy quiet settled over Ashford territory, no further word arriving from Voss lands, no additional messengers or unexpected visitors disrupting the careful rhythm Elena had built alongside Kieran. She allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that perhaps the tension Callum had warned about might simply dissipate over time, that Damon's initial reaction to news of her bond might fade into grudging acceptance, rather than escalating into something more dangerous. That hope shattered on a bright autumn morning, when a horn sounded from the eastern watchtower, the signal Elena had learned meant approaching visitors of significant importance, distinct from the simpler alerts used for ordinary travelers or trade caravans. She found Kieran already moving toward the main gate when she emerged from the lodge, his expression tight with a wariness that told her immediately something significant had arrived at their border. "It's Damon," Kieran said grimly, before she'd even had the chance to ask. "He's come himself, with a small escort, demanding an audience." Elena's stomach dropped at this news, old anxiety resurfacing despite the months of growing confidence she'd built within Ashford territory. "What does he want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer, even before Kieran's careful response confirmed it. "You, presumably," Kieran said. "Or at least some kind of confrontation about the bond between us. I won't let him take you, Elena, regardless of what claims he tries to make." They made their way together toward the main gate, where a small gathering of Ashford guards had already assembled, watching warily as Damon Voss and his escort waited at the boundary marker, refusing to cross fully into Ashford territory without explicit invitation, though the tension radiating from his posture suggested he was barely restraining himself from doing exactly that regardless of protocol. Elena hadn't seen Damon since the wedding, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of him now, older somehow despite the relatively short passage of time, exhaustion and stress etched into features that had once seemed so certain and composed. His eyes found hers immediately as they approached, something complicated flickering across his expression, before settling into careful, guarded authority. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the same commanding tone she remembered from years of watching him lead their former pack, though something beneath it now sounded strained, less certain than she recalled. "I've come to bring you home." "I am home," Elena said firmly, refusing to let old habits of deference toward her former alpha creep back into her posture or tone. "Whatever claim you believe you still hold over my choices, Damon, it ended the moment I walked away from your wedding. I don't answer to you anymore." Something flashed across Damon's face at her directness, frustration mixed with an emotion Elena couldn't quite identify, though it looked uncomfortably close to genuine pain. "You bonded with him," he said, his eyes shifting briefly to Kieran, hostility evident in every line of his expression. "With my greatest enemy, Elena. Do you understand what that means for the stability of both our territories?" "I understand that I found real connection with someone who chose me fully, without hesitation or comparison to anyone else," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the old fear still churning beneath the surface of her composure. "Something I never experienced with you, Damon. Not once, despite years of believing otherwise." Damon's jaw tightened visibly at her words, and for a long moment, silence stretched heavily between them, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through the surrounding trees. "This isn't just about you and me," he said finally, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "Pack law grants certain claims over territorial disputes involving former pack members who bond with rival alphas. I have every right to demand your return, Elena, regardless of your personal feelings on the matter." "She is not property to be claimed under territorial dispute," Kieran interrupted sharply, stepping forward slightly, his own authority radiating clearly as he positioned himself protectively beside Elena. "Elena left your pack of her own free will, sought shelter here of her own accord, and bonded with me through natural, undeniable connection that neither of us controlled or manufactured for political advantage. Whatever claims you believe pack law grants you, they don't extend to overriding a confirmed mate bond." Damon's eyes narrowed dangerously at Kieran's response, old rivalry clearly resurfacing beneath the immediate tension of the confrontation. "You would risk open conflict between our territories over this?" he demanded. "Ashford and Voss haven't engaged in direct confrontation in generations, Kieran. Are you prepared to be responsible for breaking that fragile peace? I'm prepared to protect what's mine, Kieran said firmly, his voice carrying an edge Elena hadn't heard from him before. Fierce and protective, in a way that sent an unexpected thrill through her chest, despite the danger evident in the escalating confrontation. Elena is not a bargaining chip in whatever unresolved feelings you're carrying about your own marriage, Damon. If you want to manufacture conflict out of her choice to build a genuine life here, that responsibility falls entirely on you. The reference to Damon's marriage clearly struck a nerve, his expression flickering with something raw and uncomfortable before he managed to school his features back into careful composure. This has nothing to do with my marriage, he said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. Doesn't it? Elena asked quietly, unable to fully contain the question, despite the volatile tension already thick in the air. Sophie came to me weeks ago, Damon. She told me about your distance, your distraction, the comments you've made suggesting regret about your choice. If this confrontation is truly about pack law and territorial claims, why does it feel like something far more personal is actually driving you here? Something in Damon's expression cracked slightly at her words. Old vulnerability breaking through his carefully maintained authority for just a moment, before he forced it back beneath the surface. I made a mistake, he admitted quietly, so quietly that Elena almost didn't catch the words at all. I chose Sophie because it seemed like the responsible choice, the choice our elders expected, the choice that would secure important political alliances for our pack's future stability. I told myself that responsibility mattered more than whatever uncertain connection I felt building with you over those years, Elena. Elena felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest at this admission, old hurt and confusion resurfacing, despite the genuine happiness she'd found with Kieran over the previous months. So you admit it, she said, her voice carrying more steadiness than she actually felt. You admit you chose politics and expectation over whatever you believed we shared. Yes, Damon said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. And I've spent every day since the wedding regretting that choice more than I know how to properly express. Watching you build this life here, with him, it's forced me to confront exactly how much I sacrificed for the sake of responsibility and expectation. Kieran's posture remained tense beside her, clearly unmoved by Damon's admission, protective instinct, evidently overriding any sympathy for his rival's obvious regret. Your regret doesn't grant you any claim over Elena's life now, he said firmly. Whatever mistakes you made, Damon, the consequences of those choices belong entirely to you. Elena has moved forward, built something real and lasting here. You don't get to demand she return, simply because you finally recognized what you gave up. Damon's eyes shifted between Elena and Kieran, something desperate and increasingly unstable crossing his expression, as he seemed to grasp for some argument that might still shift the situation in his favor. I'll invoke formal pack law, he said finally, his voice hardening with renewed determination. I'll bring this before the regional council, demand a formal ruling on whether Ashford's sheltering of a Voss defector constitutes a violation of territorial agreements between our packs. Do whatever you feel you must, Kieran said, his voice carrying calm certainty, despite the obvious escalation Damon was threatening. Elena and I have nothing to hide from any council ruling, Damon. Our bond is genuine, confirmed, and entirely within our rights to pursue, regardless of whatever political complications it might create for your own territory. The confrontation stretched on several minutes longer. Damon's increasingly desperate arguments met consistently with Kieran's calm, unwavering resolve, until finally, with visible frustration evident in every line of his posture, Damon turned to address Elena directly one final time. I hope you understand what you're risking, he said, his voice heavy with a complicated mixture of warning and lingering regret. A formal council ruling could go either direction, Elena. If they decide against Ashford's claim, you could be forced to return regardless of your personal wishes in the matter. Then let the council decide, Elena said, refusing to let fear override the confidence she'd built over months of learning to trust her own choices completely. I believe in what Kieran and I have built here, Damon. I'm not afraid of scrutiny, regardless of what political pressure you might bring to bear against us. Damon studied her for a long, heavy moment, something almost like grudging respect flickering briefly across his features, before he finally turned to depart, his escort falling into step behind him, as they made their way back toward the boundary marker, separating Ashford and Voss territories. "You'll hear from the council within the month," he called back over his shoulder, his voice carrying one final note of warning before he disappeared fully into the tree line, leaving Elena and Kieran standing together at the border, the weight of what had just been set into motion settling heavily around them both. "A council ruling," Elena said quietly, once Damon and his escort had fully departed, worry evident beneath the careful confidence she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "What does that actually mean, Kieran? What kind of power does the regional council actually hold over situations like this?" "More than I'd like," Kieran admitted honestly, drawing her close as they finally turned to make their way back toward the lodge. "The council governs disputes between territories when direct negotiation fails, and their rulings carry binding weight that both packs are expected to honor, at least in theory. It's rare for them to intervene in matters involving mate bonds specifically, but Damon's formal invocation of territorial dispute law complicates things considerably." Elena felt her earlier confidence wavering slightly at this explanation, the reality of what they now faced settling more heavily over her chest. "What happens if they rule against us?" she asked quietly. Kieran was silent for a long moment before responding, his expression grave despite his obvious effort to remain reassuring. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But whatever they decide, Elena, I promise you this. I will not simply hand you over to a pack and an alpha who never deserved you in the first place, regardless of what any council ruling demands. We'll find a way through this, together, whatever it takes." Elena nodded, drawing strength from his certainty, even as genuine fear settled deep in her chest at the uncertain weeks that now stretched ahead of them, the fragile peace they had built together, suddenly hanging in the balance of a decision that would ultimately rest in hands far beyond their own control. The weeks following Damon's visit passed in a haze of careful preparation, Kieran consulting regularly with the pack's senior advisors about the formal council process, gathering whatever evidence and testimony might strengthen their position when the ruling finally came before the assembled representatives of the region's major territories. Elena found herself drawn increasingly into these preparations, her own account of events forming a central piece of whatever case Kieran intended to present, though the process of revisiting painful memories from her time in Voss territory proved more emotionally taxing than she had initially anticipated. Margot proved an unexpected source of support during these difficult weeks, her decades of experience within pack politics offering valuable perspective on how councils typically approach disputes of this nature. "They'll look for precedent," she explained one afternoon, as Elena helped organize documentation in the healer's cottage, grateful for the distraction of physical work, even as her mind remained preoccupied with the looming council decision. Mate bonds are rarely overturned by territorial dispute claims, but Damon's formal invocation of pack law creates complications that pure precedent might not fully resolve. "What kind of complications?" Elena asked, setting aside the bundle of dried herbs she'd been sorting to give the older woman her full attention. "Voss territory holds significant political influence within the regional council," Margot explained carefully. "Several of the elder representatives maintain long-standing alliances with Damon's family, relationships built over generations of careful diplomacy. That kind of influence can shape rulings in ways that pure legal precedent sometimes struggles to overcome." Elena felt her earlier anxiety returning at this explanation, the reality of political maneuvering complicating what she had hoped would be a straightforward matter of confirming the legitimacy of her bond with Kieran. "So the ruling might not actually reflect what's fair or legally sound," she said quietly. "It might simply reflect whoever holds more political favor among the council members." "Councils are rarely perfectly objective," Margot admitted honestly. "But that doesn't mean the truth carries no weight at all, child. If you can demonstrate clearly that Damon's claims are rooted in personal regret rather than legitimate territorial concern, that kind of evidence can shift even politically motivated proceedings toward a fairer outcome." Elena considered this carefully, an idea slowly forming as she thought back over everything Sophie had shared during her difficult visit weeks earlier. Sophie mentioned that Damon's behavior changed noticeably once word of my bond with Kieran reached Voss territory, she said slowly. If she were willing to testify to that shift, to confirm that his motivation for pursuing this dispute stems from personal regret rather than legitimate concern about pack stability, That could strengthen our position considerably. Margot's expression grew thoughtful at this suggestion. It could, she agreed, though asking your sister to testify against her own husband in a formal council proceeding carries significant risk for her, Elena. You'd need to consider carefully whether that's a burden you're willing to ask her to bear, especially given her current pregnancy and the strain already evident in her marriage. Elena knew the older woman was right, understood the weight of what she would be asking of Sophie if she pursued this avenue of evidence. But as the days passed and the council date drew steadily closer, she found herself increasingly convinced that Sophie's testimony might prove essential to securing a fair ruling, one that reflected the genuine circumstances of her bond with Kieran rather than political maneuvering rooted in Damon's personal regret. She sent word to Sophie through the same careful network of neutral traders they'd relied on throughout the previous months, explaining the situation honestly and leaving the decision entirely in her sister's hands, unwilling to pressure Sophie into a choice that might further complicate her already precarious position within Voss territory. The response, when it finally arrived nearly a week later, surprised Elena with its immediate and unwavering conviction. Sophie's letter arrived, carried by a young trader Elena didn't recognize, the paper worn from careful handling during the journey. Sophie wrote that she had already begun to suspect Damon's growing instability was rooted in something deeper than simple political concern, that his behavior in recent weeks had grown increasingly erratic and difficult, culminating in an argument during which he had finally admitted, in a moment of uncharacteristic vulnerability, that he had never fully released his feelings for Elena, that marrying Sophie had been, at least in part, a calculated decision meant to secure political stability, rather than a choice built on genuine devotion. The letter continued, Sophie's careful handwriting growing increasingly urgent as she described her decision to testify before the council, regardless of the personal cost such testimony might carry within her marriage. She wrote that she deserved better than a partnership built on comparison and unresolved regret, that their child deserved a mother who modeled genuine self-respect rather than quiet acceptance of diminished treatment, and that if her testimony could help secure a fair outcome for Elena, while also finally forcing an honest reckoning within her own marriage, she was prepared to offer it regardless of the difficulty involved. Elena read the letter several times, moved deeply by her sister's courage, by the genuine growth evident in Sophie's willingness to prioritize truth and fairness over the easier path of quiet complicity within a struggling marriage. She shared the letter with Kieran that evening, watching his expression shift through surprise and genuine respect as he absorbed the full weight of what Sophie was offering to risk on their behalf. "Your sister is remarkably brave," Kieran said finally, setting the letter carefully aside. "This can't be an easy decision for her, especially given her current circumstances." "She's braver than I ever gave her credit for," Elena agreed, genuine pride evident in her voice despite the complicated history still coloring her relationship with her sister. "I think losing so much certainty within her marriage has forced her to discover a strength she didn't know she possessed." Over the following weeks, additional pieces of evidence slowly emerged, gathered carefully by Kieran's advisors and by loyal contacts within Voss territory, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with their alpha's erratic behavior since Elena's departure. A senior pack elder, someone who had served as advisor to Damon's father before his passing, came forward with testimony confirming that Damon had, in fact, expressed private uncertainty about his feelings toward Elena in the weeks leading up to his wedding to Sophie, uncertainty he had ultimately chosen to suppress in favor of the politically advantageous match that marrying Sophie represented. This testimony, combined with Sophie's own willingness to speak honestly about her husband's behavior since the wedding, painted an increasingly clear picture that Kieran's advisors believed would prove compelling before the assembled council, demonstrating that Damon's formal invocation of territorial dispute law was motivated far more by personal regret and unresolved feelings than by any legitimate concern about pack stability or political precedent. Elena found herself growing cautiously more confident as the council date approached, though the underlying anxiety never fully disappeared, old fear of losing everything she had built in Ashford territory lingering stubbornly beneath the surface of her outward composure. She spent long hours reviewing her own testimony with Kieran and his advisors, careful to present her account of events with clarity and honesty, refusing to exaggerate or embellish details in ways that might undermine the fundamental truth of her experience. "You don't need to convince them of anything beyond the truth," Kieran reminded her one evening, as they reviewed her prepared statement for what felt like the 100th time. "The facts speak clearly enough on their own, Elena. You left a pack that failed to value you properly, found genuine connection here, through no manipulation or political calculation, and built a life that deserves recognition and protection under any fair reading of pack law." Elena appreciated his steady confidence, though she couldn't fully shake her own nervousness about what the coming weeks would bring. She thought often of Sophie during this period, worried about the strain her sister's decision to testify might place on an already fragile marriage, worried about the physical toll the ongoing stress might take on a pregnancy, already complicated by the emotional turmoil surrounding it. She sent word regularly, checking on her sister's well-being, and offering whatever support and encouragement she could provide from a distance, grateful when Sophie's responses continued arriving steadily, each one carrying the same unwavering resolve, despite the obvious difficulty of her circumstances within Voss territory. Sophie wrote that Damon had grown increasingly withdrawn since learning of her decision to testify, that their interactions had become strained and careful, though he had not yet forbidden her from traveling to the council proceedings, perhaps recognizing that any attempt to prevent her testimony would only strengthen the case against him further. As the council date finally arrived, nearly 6 weeks after Damon's initial confrontation at the Ashford border, Elena found herself standing once again at the edge of the training grounds, where so much of her journey in this unfamiliar territory had unfolded, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, drawing strength from the quiet beauty of a landscape that had become, over the previous months, genuinely and completely her home. Kieran joined her there, as he had so many mornings before, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and resting his chin gently atop her head as they watched the day fully break over the horizon. "Whatever happens today," he said softly, "I need you to know that nothing about my commitment to you changes based on any council ruling. You are mine, Elena, in every way that matters, regardless of what political maneuvering Damon attempts to bring against us." Elena turned in his embrace to face him fully, drawing comfort from the steady certainty in his eyes, the same unwavering devotion that had carried her through every difficult moment since her arrival in this unexpected sanctuary. "Thank you for believing in this, in us, even when I struggled to fully trust it myself," she said softly. "Always," Kieran promised, leaning down to press a gentle kiss against her forehead before finally releasing her, both of them turning to prepare for whatever the day's proceedings would ultimately bring, uncertain of the outcome, but steady in their shared commitment to face it together, regardless of whatever challenges still lay ahead. The council hall stood on neutral ground between the major territories of the region, an ancient stone structure that had witnessed countless disputes over the centuries, its walls carrying the weight of decisions that had shaped pack relations for generations. Elena had never stepped inside before, and the sheer scale of the building left her feeling smaller and more vulnerable than she wanted to admit, as she and Kieran made their way through the grand entrance, flanked by his senior advisors and the small group of witnesses who had traveled with them to offer testimony on their behalf. The main chamber was already filling with representatives from surrounding territories by the time they arrived, 7 senior council members seated at an elevated table at the front of the room, each representing different regions and holding equal voice in whatever ruling would ultimately be decided. Elena recognized none of them personally, though she'd heard enough about the council's reputation over the previous weeks to understand the weight their collective judgment carried. Damon arrived shortly after, accompanied by his own advisors, and, Elena noted with a mixture of relief and lingering worry, Sophie, walking carefully beside him, despite the visible strain evident in her posture. Her sister caught Elena's eye across the chamber, offering a small, determined nod that carried volumes of unspoken solidarity despite the difficult circumstances that had brought them both to this moment. The proceedings began formally, one of the senior council members outlining the nature of the dispute for the assembled representatives, explaining Damon's formal claim that Ashford territory's sheltering of a Voss defector, followed by the subsequent mate bond between Elena and Kieran, constituted a violation of long-standing territorial agreements between the two rival packs. The explanation was delivered with careful neutrality, though Elena could sense an undercurrent of curiosity among the assembled representatives, clearly aware that this case carried personal complications beyond simple territorial dispute. Damon spoke first, presenting his case with the same commanding authority Elena remembered from years of watching him lead their former pack, though something beneath his composed exterior seemed strained in a way she hadn't noticed as clearly during their confrontation at the Ashford border. He argued carefully constructed points about precedent and territorial stability, about the dangerous implications of allowing pack members to defect freely to rival territories without consequence, about the potential for Ashford's actions to be interpreted as a deliberate provocation given the historical tensions between their two packs. Elena listened carefully, noting the careful way Damon avoided any mention of his personal history with her, framing the entire dispute in purely political and legal terms, clearly hoping to keep the proceedings focused on abstract precedent rather than the messier personal truths that had actually driven the conflict to this point. When it came time for Kieran to present their response, he did so with the same steady confidence Elena had come to rely on throughout their months together, methodically dismantling Damon's arguments about precedent by citing previous council rulings that had consistently protected the legitimacy of confirmed mate bonds, regardless of the political complications they might create between territories. The council has ruled repeatedly and consistently that mate bonds represent a fundamental right that supersedes territorial dispute claims, Kieran argued, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled chamber. Elena did not defect to Ashford territory as some calculated political maneuver against Voss. She sought shelter after leaving her former pack of her own free will, following circumstances that left her with nowhere else to turn. The bond that subsequently formed between us was neither manufactured nor manipulated for political advantage. It is real, confirmed, and deserving of the same protection this council has extended to countless other bonded pairs throughout its history. Damon's advisors attempted to counter this argument, questioning the timeline of events, suggesting that the speed with which Elena's bond with Kieran had formed raised legitimate questions about whether genuine circumstances or calculated political strategy had truly driven their connection. Elena felt her nervousness spike at this line of questioning, though Kieran remained unshaken, calling forward the first of their prepared witnesses to address these concerns directly. Margot spoke first, offering careful testimony about Elena's genuine emotional state during her earliest weeks in Ashford territory, describing the visible grief and uncertainty that had colored her arrival, testimony that clearly demonstrated no calculated political strategy had been at play in Elena's initial decision to seek shelter with Ashford's healer and pack members. Several other Ashford pack members offered similar testimony, painting a consistent picture of Elena's gradual, organic integration into pack life, the slow building of trust and connection with Kieran that had unfolded naturally over weeks, rather than through any hasty or suspicious circumstances that might suggest political calculation rather than genuine emotional development. But it was Sophie's testimony that ultimately shifted the tenor of the entire proceeding, her voice trembling slightly as she rose to address the assembled council, though her words carried a steady conviction that commanded the room's full attention despite her obvious nervousness. "I am Damon Voss's wife," she began, her eyes briefly finding Damon's stricken expression, before returning to the council members awaiting her testimony. "And I believe this council deserves the complete truth about what has actually motivated my husband's pursuit of this formal dispute, truth that extends beyond the political and legal arguments already presented." The chamber fell into complete silence as Sophie continued, her voice growing steadier as she described the shift in Damon's behavior following news of Elena's mate bond with Kieran, the distance and distraction that had colored their marriage since that news first reached Voss territory. The argument during which Damon had finally admitted, in a moment of raw honesty he had likely not intended to share, that his choice to marry Sophie had been motivated significantly by political calculation and unresolved uncertainty about his feelings for Elena, rather than genuine devotion, built entirely on its own merit. Damon's expression grew increasingly stricken as Sophie's testimony continued, old composure crumbling visibly as the private truths he had clearly hoped to keep buried beneath careful political argument were laid bare before the assembled council representatives. Several of the council members exchanged meaningful glances as Sophie finished her testimony, the implications of her words clearly reshaping their understanding of the true motivations behind Damon's formal dispute claim. "This isn't simply a matter of territorial stability or legal precedent," Sophie said finally, her voice carrying genuine emotion, despite the visible difficulty of publicly acknowledging such painful truths about her own marriage. "My husband is pursuing this dispute because he regrets his own choices, because he cannot accept that Elena found genuine happiness elsewhere after he failed to choose her when he had the opportunity. That regret does not constitute legitimate grounds for overturning a confirmed mate bond, regardless of whatever legal arguments have been constructed to disguise its true origins." The senior council member presiding over the proceedings called for a brief recess following Sophie's testimony, the assembled representatives clearly needing time to fully absorb the significant shift in understanding her words had provided. Elena found herself embraced tightly by Kieran during the recess, both of them watching with cautious hope as the council members conferred quietly among themselves, the outcome of the entire proceeding now clearly hanging in a more favorable balance than it had before Sophie's courageous testimony had reshaped the narrative entirely. Damon approached Elena briefly during the recess, his expression carrying none of the earlier authority he had displayed at the Ashford border weeks before, replaced instead by something raw and defeated that Elena found herself, despite everything, feeling a complicated pang of sympathy toward. "I didn't intend for things to reach this point," he said quietly, his voice carrying genuine regret that Elena couldn't quite dismiss as simple political maneuvering. "I convinced myself that pursuing this dispute was about legitimate territorial concerns, but Sophie's right. It was never really about that at all." "I know," Elena said, her voice steady despite the complicated emotions still churning beneath her composure. "I hope you can find peace with these choices eventually, Damon. But that peace can't come at the cost of my happiness, or Sophie's, simply because you finally recognized what your own decisions cost you." Damon nodded slowly, something like acceptance finally settling into his expression as he absorbed the full weight of her words. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I hope you're happy with him, genuinely happy, in whatever way I clearly failed to make you feel during our years together." Elena studied him for a long moment, old hurt finally beginning to fully release its grip on her chest, as she recognized the genuine sincerity behind his admission. "Thank you," she said simply, before turning to rejoin Kieran as the council prepared to reconvene, the weight of everything that had unfolded during that difficult, revealing morning finally beginning to settle into something that felt, cautiously, like the possibility of resolution. The council reconvened nearly an hour later, the assembled representatives settling back into their elevated seats with expressions considerably more grave than they had carried before the recess. Elena's heart pounded steadily as she took her seat beside Kieran, watching the presiding council member rise to address the chamber, uncertain whether Sophie's revealing testimony had been enough to shift the ultimate ruling in their favor. "This council has heard extensive testimony regarding the circumstances surrounding the mate bond between Kieran Ashford and Elena Marsh," the presiding member began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber. "We have carefully considered the arguments presented by both parties, along with the testimony offered by numerous witnesses regarding the genuine nature of the circumstances that led to this bond's formation." Elena felt Kieran's hand tighten around hers beneath the table, both of them bracing for whatever the council's decision would ultimately be, months of uncertainty and preparation culminating in this single, weighted moment. "It is the finding of this council," the presiding member continued, "that the mate bond between Kieran Ashford and Elena Marsh represents a genuine, unmanipulated connection, formed through circumstances that in no way constitute a calculated political strategy against Voss territory. Elena Marsh's departure from her former pack was motivated by legitimate personal circumstances entirely separate from any territorial ambition, and her subsequent bond with Alpha Ashford developed organically over a period of months, consistent with the natural formation of confirmed mate bonds this council has protected in countless previous rulings. A wave of relief washed through Elena so powerfully that she felt momentarily lightheaded, Kieran's steady grip on her hand, the only thing keeping her fully grounded, as the presiding member continued speaking, her words confirming what Elena had hoped for, but hadn't allowed herself to fully believe until this exact moment. Furthermore, the council member continued, her tone shifting to something noticeably firmer, this council finds that Alpha Damon Voss's formal invocation of territorial dispute law appears to have been motivated significantly by personal regret, rather than legitimate concern regarding pack stability or precedent, a motivation confirmed through testimony offered voluntarily by his own wife, Luna Sophie Voss. This council takes seriously any attempt to misuse formal legal proceedings for personal grievance, rather than genuine territorial concern, and while we recognize the difficult personal circumstances that clearly motivated this dispute, we caution Alpha Voss against future attempts to leverage political and legal mechanisms in service of personal rather than territorial interests. The formal rebuke, delivered with careful diplomatic language but unmistakable weight, settled visibly over Damon, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of embarrassment and resigned acceptance as the council's judgment was formally recorded before the assembled representatives. Therefore, the presiding member concluded, this council formally recognizes and protects the mate bond between Kieran Ashford and Elena Marsh, dismissing Alpha Voss's territorial dispute claim in its entirety. Elena Marsh is free to remain within Ashford territory and to pursue whatever future she chooses alongside Alpha Ashford, without further interference or legal challenge from Voss territory. The chamber erupted into quiet murmurs of reaction as the ruling was formally recorded, and Elena finally allowed herself to release the breath she felt she'd been holding throughout the entire lengthy proceeding, tears of genuine relief gathering at the corners of her eyes as Kieran pulled her into a fierce embrace, both of them overwhelmed by the certainty that their future together now stood fully protected and legitimized. "We did it," Elena whispered against his shoulder, hardly able to fully believe the weight of uncertainty that had finally lifted from her chest after months of careful preparation and anxious waiting. "You did it," Kieran corrected gently, pulling back slightly to meet her eyes with obvious pride and admiration. "Your courage in sharing your story, your sister's bravery in offering her testimony, despite the personal cost, that's what secured this ruling, Elena. I'm simply grateful to have stood beside you through it." Elena sought out Sophie across the chamber, finding her sister watching the proceedings' conclusion with an expression that mixed relief for Elena's clear victory with obvious apprehension about what her own testimony would mean for her marriage moving forward. Elena made her way toward her immediately, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace, regardless of the many observers still filling the chamber around them. "Thank you," Elena said fiercely, holding her sister close. "I know how much courage that took, Sophie. I won't forget it." "You would have done the same for me," Sophie said, though her voice carried a slight tremor that suggested the emotional weight of the day hadn't fully settled yet. "I meant every word I said in there, Elena. I'm done pretending things are fine when they're not, done accepting less than I deserve, simply because leaving feels complicated." Elena pulled back slightly to study her sister's face, recognizing genuine resolve there despite the obvious exhaustion and emotional strain of the day's proceedings. "What does that mean for you now?" she asked carefully. Sophie glanced briefly toward where Damon stood, still absorbing the council's formal rebuke. His advisors clustered protectively around him, though his posture suggested a man far more concerned with the personal implications of the ruling than the political ones. "I think it means I need time," Sophie said finally. "Time to figure out what I actually want, separate from whatever expectations our families and our packs have placed on this marriage. I love this baby, Elena, more than I know how to properly express. But I'm no longer certain that staying with Damon serves either of us well, especially not after everything that's come to light today." Elena squeezed her sister's hand supportively, understanding the weight of the decision Sophie was clearly beginning to work through, even amid the immediate aftermath of such an emotionally exhausting day. "Whatever you decide, you have a place with us," Elena said firmly. "Ashford territory would welcome you, Sophie, regardless of the history between our packs. You're my sister. That matters more than any political rivalry." Sophie's eyes filled with fresh tears at this offer, gratitude evident in her expression, despite the obvious complexity of everything she still needed to work through regarding her marriage and her own uncertain future. "I might take you up on that," she admitted quietly. "Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually, once I've had time to think through everything properly." The sisters embraced once more before the chamber finally began emptying, representatives and witnesses alike departing the historic council hall as the momentous proceedings of the day drew to their formal close. Elena watched Damon depart with his advisors, his posture carrying none of the confident authority he had displayed during their earlier confrontation at the Ashford border, replaced instead by something considerably more subdued and reflective. As they made their way back toward Ashford territory later that afternoon, Elena found herself reflecting on the complicated journey that had brought her to this moment, the painful humiliation of watching Damon marry her sister, the desperate flight into unknown territory, the unexpected sanctuary she had found among people her old pack had taught her to fear, and finally, the confirmed bond and formal legal protection that now secured her future, alongside a man who had shown her, consistently and without hesitation, exactly what genuine devotion actually looked like. "How are you feeling?" Kieran asked, noticing her thoughtful silence as they walked together through the familiar forest paths leading back toward Ashford lands. "Grateful," Elena said honestly, reaching for his hand as they walked. "For everything that's happened, even the painful parts, because they led me here, to you, to a life I never could have imagined for myself the night I walked away from that wedding." Kieran brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his eyes carrying the same steady devotion that had characterized every moment of their relationship since her earliest days in Ashford territory. "I'm grateful too," he said softly, "for every difficult step that led you to this border, Elena, and for every day since that you've chosen to stay, to trust, to build something real with me, despite everything you'd survived before we met." They walked the remaining distance back toward the lodge in comfortable silence, the formal council ruling now firmly securing the future they had spent months carefully building together, though Elena understood that the true celebration of everything they had overcome still lay ahead, waiting to be properly honored once the immediate exhaustion of the day's proceedings had finally settled into something calmer and more certain. 3 months passed following the council's ruling, months that carried Elena through the changing colors of autumn into the first crisp mornings of winter, each day settling her more completely into the life she had built within Ashford territory. The formal legal protection secured by the council's decision had brought a steadiness to her days that she hadn't fully realized she was missing until it finally arrived, the constant undercurrent of uncertainty that had shadowed even her happiest moments with Kieran, finally replaced by genuine, unshakable confidence in the future they were building together. Word had reached Ashford territory several weeks after the council proceedings that Sophie had formally separated from Damon, choosing to relocate temporarily to neutral territory with her newborn daughter, a decision that had reportedly sent ripples of concern through Voss Pack leadership, but had been met with quiet understanding from the pack members who had witnessed the strain in their alpha's marriage over recent months. Elena had visited her sister and new niece twice since the separation, finding Sophie tired but genuinely more settled than Elena had seen her in over a year, the weight of pretending contentment finally lifted from her shoulders. "I don't regret leaving," Sophie had told her during their most recent visit, cradling her infant daughter carefully as they sat together near a warm fire. "I regret that it took me so long to recognize what I actually needed, but I don't regret finally choosing myself, and this little one, over staying in a marriage that was never built on the foundation it should have had." Elena had held her niece for the first time during that visit, marveling at the tiny, perfect features that carried traces of both her sister and, undeniably, of Damon as well, complicated feelings settling gently in her chest as she considered the innocent child caught at the center of everything that had unfolded over the preceding months. Whatever complicated history existed between the adults involved, this small, precious life deserved nothing but genuine love and stability moving forward, and Elena found herself grateful that Sophie seemed determined to provide exactly that, regardless of the personal cost her difficult decisions had required. Damon, for his part, had made no further attempts to challenge the council's ruling or to reach out to Elena directly, though word occasionally reached Ashford territory through trade channels that he remained alpha of Voss Pack, his leadership notably more subdued and reflective than it had been during the confident years before his hasty marriage to Sophie. Elena felt no particular satisfaction in his diminished circumstances, only a quiet hope that he might eventually find genuine peace and growth from everything that had unfolded, even as she remained firmly committed to never allowing his choices to shape her own future again. As winter settled fully over Ashford territory, Kieran approached her one evening with a request that Elena had, on some level, been anticipating for weeks, though the formal weight of the moment still caught her breath when it finally arrived. They stood together near the same creek where he had first shared Marisol's story with her months earlier, snow beginning to dust the surrounding branches as the last light of day faded into evening. "I want to formally name you Luna of Ashford Pack," Kieran said, his voice carrying the same careful sincerity that had characterized every significant moment of their relationship since her arrival in this territory. "Not simply as my mate, though that bond remains the foundation of everything between us, but as an equal partner in leading this pack forward, someone whose voice and judgment I trust completely in shaping our future together." Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, moved deeply by the weight and sincerity of his request, by the genuine partnership he was offering her, so different from the passive role she had once imagined for herself during her years hoping for a future with Damon. "I would be honored," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "More honored than I know how to properly express, Kieran." The formal ceremony took place 3 weeks later, held within the same stone hall where Elena had first been brought as a frightened, exhausted stranger months earlier, though the space now felt entirely transformed, decorated with evergreen boughs and warm lantern light, filled with pack members who had watched her journey unfold from wary curiosity to genuine, wholehearted welcome. Margot stood proudly near the front of the gathered crowd, having become something like a second mother to Elena over the course of her time in Ashford territory, her weathered face beaming with obvious pride as the ceremony began. Sophie had traveled from her new territory to attend, her infant daughter carried carefully in her arms as she took her seat among the honored guests, the sisters exchanging warm, meaningful glances throughout the ceremony that spoke to the genuine rebuilding of their relationship over the difficult months since the wedding that had first set this entire journey into motion. As Elena stood before the assembled pack, Kieran beside her, the presiding elder speaking the formal words that would confirm her position as Luna of Ashford territory, she found her mind drifting briefly back to that painful night months earlier, standing in a different pack hall, watching Damon place a ring on Sophie's finger, while her own heart shattered quietly, amid a crowd too focused on celebration to notice her pain. She had walked away from that hall believing she had lost everything that mattered, uncertain what future could possibly await her beyond the wreckage of assumptions and hopes that had defined her entire adult life until that devastating moment. She could never have imagined, standing there in her humiliation and grief, that walking away would lead her here, to this hall, to this man, to a partnership built on genuine equality and unwavering devotion rather than quiet hope and unspoken assumption. "Do you, Elena Marsh, accept the responsibility and honor of serving as Luna of Ashford Pack, standing as equal partner and guide alongside Alpha Kieran Ashford?" the presiding elder asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I do," Elena said, her voice steady and certain, carrying none of the uncertainty that had colored so much of her journey during those first difficult months after leaving Voss territory. The hall erupted into warm applause and howls of celebration as the formal ceremony concluded, Kieran pulling her into a joyful embrace before the assembled crowd, both of them laughing with genuine happiness as pack members surged forward to offer their congratulations and well wishes for the future, now formally secured between them. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Elena found a quiet moment to step outside, drawn by the same pull toward the training grounds that had characterized so many significant moments throughout her time in Ashford territory. Kieran joined her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they looked out over the snow-dusted landscape, stars beginning to emerge overhead as the celebration's warm light and music carried faintly from the hall behind them. "Do you ever think about that night?" Elena asked quietly. "The night I arrived here, exhausted and terrified, with nothing but a small bag and a broken heart?" "Often," Kieran admitted, resting his chin gently atop her head. "I think about how easily things could have gone differently if my scouts hadn't found you at the border, if I'd made a different choice about taking you in that first night. I'm endlessly grateful that circumstances led you to us, Elena, that whatever pain brought you to our territory, ultimately led to everything we've built together since. Elena turned in his embrace to face him fully, studying the man who had shown her, patiently and consistently, exactly what genuine partnership and devotion actually looked like, so different from the passive hope she had once mistaken for real connection. "I used to believe that losing Damon meant losing everything that mattered," she said softly. "I understand now how wrong I was. Losing him meant finally becoming free to find what I actually needed, what I deserved all along." "And what's that?" Kieran asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer, wanting simply to hear her articulate it fully in her own words. "Someone who chooses me completely, without comparison or hesitation," Elena said, her voice carrying the full weight of everything she had learned throughout her difficult, but ultimately transformative journey. "Someone who sees my strength and values it, rather than simply expecting quiet acceptance of whatever role others decide to assign me. I found that here, Kieran, in the last place I ever expected to look." Kieran leaned down to kiss her gently, the celebration continuing warmly behind them, snow beginning to fall softly around them as they stood together beneath the emerging stars, two former strangers from rival territories who had found, against every expectation and old rivalry, exactly the kind of genuine, unshakable love that Elena had once believed lost to her forever. She thought, standing there in his embrace, of the frightened, heartbroken woman who had walked away from that painful wedding all those months earlier, uncertain of anything except her refusal to remain somewhere that diminished her. That woman could never have imagined this moment, this life, this partnership, built on genuine equality and unwavering devotion. But standing here now, formally recognized as Luna, of a pack that had welcomed her with open arms, despite generations of rivalry with her former home, Elena finally understood that her painful ending had never actually been an ending at all. It had been, all along, simply the beginning of a story she never could have written for herself, but one that had ultimately given her everything she had once believed impossible to find again.